He jolted awake with a start, sweat beading on his head, the world around him darkness. He squirmed and tried to get up when he suddenly felt the cold reality that his arms wouldn't move, strapped behind him, bound by ropes at the wrist. He attempted to get to his feet, only to slump over like a worm, seeing that his ankles were just as tied as his wrists were. He was a prisoner. He'd actually been taken prisoner. But how? He looked around to see the nature of his prison and perhaps get an idea of where he was and who had taken him, because he couldn't recall being in any battle. In fact, ever since Astria's fall at the hands of the Hatun, Masayori had been very careful to evade the Hatun's warpath. He'd fled to the mire, as well as various other elements of Horkos that were now on the run. Some of his fellow Horkos warriors had sought out new battlefields, or they hoped to hunt down Vela, Ravier, Vortiger, Sakura, Sunda, Gaius, anyone they could find who might help them rebuild what they'd lost. But Masayori was no fool. He knew that the key to survival is to know that a fight isn't always necessary. The smart warrior knows when they're licked and they should lay low, and that's what he'd done. Masayori had kept his head down, melded into the mire, and stayed out of the way of the Hatuns, the samurai, and any chimera remnants who might be hunting him. He'd spent almost 6 months like that, and there was no sign that Horkos would ever make a comeback. Sure, there were rumors that Vortiger had successfully ferried away the Horkos treasure, but if he had heard about it, then other interested parties would have heard about it too, and there was no shortage of pirates who would like to hunt him down and get it. There had been no word of the fate of Vela or Ravier or Maddox or Sunda or Gaius. Truly, it seemed Horkos was dead and done. Clearly, Masayori needed a new way of making money. He was even considering taking some simple bodyguard or mercenary work. He found a decent enough band of reprobates he wouldn't mind sharing a few drinks with. Then he'd gone to bed in his hideaway, only to now wake up here. So who had him? Chimera? The Hatun? Sakura? He wasn't sure he wanted to know, and yet he didn't recognize any of where he was. The prison he was in was dark. The only light coming into his cell was a single window looking out at a night sky with clouds drifting against a lazy but lovely moon above. Cool air flowed in, and the smell of cedar. Well, that revealed one thing at least. He was in Ashfeld. But how had he gotten here? He grimaced and sneered. Who in Ashfeld would want anything to do with him? At last there was a sound of movement. He stopped squirming and looked up, his bald head scraping the floor of his cell as he looked up from his position. A door on the far side of his room, shrouded by shadow so he couldn't see it at first, suddenly slid open, letting in a low orange glow of light beyond. Then a figure walked in. The musical clank of armor told him it was a knight, and then she entered the moonlight of his cell. Her armor was a pitch gray like snow and shadow. Her black cape flowed like water behind her as she moved, and in her clawed, gauntleted hand she held a savage Zweihander sword in a loose grip. Her face was hidden by her helm that glared at him with a look of malice. He didn't need to see her face to know she was sneering at him. This was a warmonger, and she looked somehow familiar, but he couldn't quite place where he'd seen this armored woman before. It wasn't too surprising, though. Warmongers were abundantly common in Horkos, so he'd met several. But he couldn't shake the notion that he knew this one. "Are you with Horkos?" Masayori snarled. "Come on, untie me. Let's get out of here." But the warmonger didn't reply. She simply stared and then walked around him as if inspecting a prized animal for purchase. Masayori didn't like the way her face hid her expression. It made her seem less human. "Hurry up already! Don't you know who I am? I'm—" "Yasuda Masayori," the warmonger answered sharply, silencing him. "I know who you are." Her voice was not as harsh as most of her order. It was soft, almost like that of a singer. However, the words were like cutting knives, fierce and direct, and without any sense of tact or kindness. "Good! Then you know who I'm—" "You're a Hitakiri and a lieutenant of Horkos. You served under Abathar the Mant, leader of the 8th Division. You were his right-hand man, and his liaison to the Inquisition." Now it was Masayori's turn to look stunned. How did she know that? Horkos was a vast and expansive order, and even its division commanders didn't know all their followers by name. Yet this warmonger had stated not only his full name, but his commander, and she even knew he was tied to the Inquisition. Then I take it you served with me in the 8th?
I was with the 3rd, she answered.
The 3rd? You're one of Rohavat's underlings. Fine. Then what business do you have with me? If you're with the 3rd, it means you're still Horkos. Now get me out of here! The warmonger finally walked around towards him and knelt to look him in the face. At last she reached up her hand and pulled off the helmet. She had fair skin with a small set of scars on her neck, and then one very long one running from her neckline up her cheek and across the bridge of her nose, nearly hitting her left eye. Her eyes were a cold blue-gray, not unlike a wolf, and her hair a deep brown, and the roots were dark. Her hair was braided back behind her head, shaved gently just above the ears on both sides. Her expression was hard like a jagged stone, her lips contorted in a sneer that seemed naturally fixed to that position, as if a smile might shatter her face irrevocably. Masayori stared, and a slow familiarity dawned on him. He remembered vaguely a woman, in her 20s, newly recruited warmonger assigned to the prison fortress of Shanam, where several high-value prisoners of Horkos were kept. He remembered her face, wide-eyed at the time, a nervous girl who still struggled to handle her sword efficiently. He'd only seen her in passing, never gave her much thought. But he remembered that hair, those eyes, those scars, and he realized this was her. But that realization didn't make him feel comforted. There was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't here to set him free. He started to squirm again as the woman glared at him with those dangerous eyes. And then, a name. Azazel? Just as the name left his lips, the warmonger swung out her clawed gauntlet and struck him across the face with a mighty slash that cleaved the flesh from his cheek, opening 3 livid gashes from her claws. He yelped and hissed bitter curses from the strike. The woman's expression did not change as she hissed her reply. My name is Seline. Masayori groaned as he left bloody trickle falling down his face, and he glared furiously at the woman, hate in his heart. This woman, Seline, Azazel, whatever she called herself. She simply walked past him and towards the window, looking out at the moon as if suddenly very interested in it, more so than him. She said nothing, and Masayori waited for her to say anything, to explain herself, but instead she just stared at the moon and breathed slowly. Anger bubbled in Masayori's throat, and finally he could contain himself no longer. What the hell do you want with me? There was a very long wait with no answer. She didn't even acknowledge he'd spoken. I said, what do you want? If you just wanted me dead, I would be. So out with it. What do you want with me?
Do you believe in God, Masayori? She finally asked.
Masayori stared at her with a dumbfounded, gaping mouth. What?
I can't imagine you do. Though the Order of Horkos claims to follow the god Horkos, I suspect that the vast majority believe only in power and strength of a personal nature. I don't blame you for this, because I was just like you. Her gaze did not turn from the window as she spoke, as though this was more meant for her own ears than his. When I was a girl, I didn't buy into the sermons and the lessons my father and mother taught me. I wasn't convinced there was truly a God of love or truth watching over us. How could there be when there's so much bloodshed? As she spoke, Masayori strained against his bindings and, to his shock, he felt a slight slip. The rope was finally starting to give. Hope filled him as he tried to mask his excitement. He slowly began to wriggle his wrists against the ropes to make them more slack. When the cult of the stake attacked my town, I sought help from Horkos and the Inquisition. I was told the Inquisition would save my home, and that I would one day see my family again. I was just a young woman then, foolish. Did you know I had aspirations to be married one day? I even had my eyes set on this baker's son from my town, a very handsome man. I sometimes wonder if he would have ever proposed if I'd just approached him with more confidence. But the past is set in stone, and I can't change what was no more than I could pluck the moon out of the sky. As if to demonstrate this statement, her gauntleted hand reached up towards the moon, as if to grasp it, but only closed empty air. You're insane! Completely insane! Masayori snarled, as he pushed further against the rope. Yes, I was, she answered absent-mindedly. I was completely mad, you know, believing that things could possibly go back to the way they were. I joined Horkos and took the oaths of a warmonger, accepting my demon name Azazel, and was posted at Shanam, all in the blissful hope that one day I'd get to go home and see my family and tell them all that I'd done for them. Find that sweet baker's son and kiss him like I'd always dreamed I would. But madness, insanity, is just willful ignorance, a denial of reality and what's real. The truth was revealed after I spoke with Godric Leadus. He urged me to return home that night we spoke, pleaded with me to behold what the Inquisition had done to save my family. And do you know what it was I found?
Masaori finally felt the rope give way, and his hands were at last free. They went to his ankles and tore at the ropes there to free his feet. He'd be able to attack in mere moments, just a little closer. Like I care what you saw, he snarled, and with a burst of strength and speed, he ripped away the ropes binding him and tore at Seline, his hands outstretched to grab her throat from behind and strangle the life from her. He would kill her. He'd kill her and finally be free.
I found God.
She had entered the town and saw not the home she once knew, bright and beautiful, even in the dark evenings, but cold and dank. There were lanterns on in the quiet twilight, but there was no sound. The children, laughing, were gone. No people conversing and talking in the streets. No knights patrolling the entryway. There was only a haunting aura of foreboding and warning. She entered the town gates, and she was greeted by a sick, wretched stench. The screams of rats finally alerting her to life as large rodents as big as cats scurried away in fear at her coming. The ground felt slick, and yet there had not been any rain in days. She noted it was coated with grime, feces, and dried blood. Her heart caught in her throat, and fear gripped her soul. Had the Inquisition arrived too late, she wondered? Had the cult killed everyone, and the Inquisition had saved no one? That was the prayer she uttered to herself, but in her heart she knew it was not the answer. As she marched deeper into the town, she entered the square, and she saw the truth in all its wretched horror. Built ramshackled in the center of the square was a long gallows, 8 nooses hanging 8 corpses as they swayed, rotting, carrying the pungent odor on the wind. She felt herself retch and become sick as she gazed at the bodies. They were semi-rotted, and a few were nothing but skeletons swinging like wind chimes as their bones clattered against each other musically. But at the far end, on the right side, she saw a skeleton with a hint of something silver on its chest. And the closer she stared, she saw a small pendant that she recognized as having been worn by a baker's son she'd once yearned to kiss. Even now, looking at the skull, she could envision his infectious smile. Were that not enough for her, swinging from the noose right next to his was a skeleton far smaller than any of the others. Small as a child, crows clinging to the bones and pecking any trace of remaining meat left. She screamed. She howled with mournful sorrow at the sight before her. She hugged herself as if to stop her shaking body, but there was nothing to stop the tears, the horror, or the truth. No kindness would amend this travesty. She did not see the bodies of her parents, but she didn't need to, and she didn't want to. She knew without seeing what had become of them. She knew, and the knowledge drew from her another howl of anguish, which caused the crows to scatter in alarm. "What's going on out here?" The voice was raspy and cold, joined by the clattering of feet on cobblestone as more soldiers ran to join it. Seline turned to see the source, and she beheld a tall warden flanked by a black prior, a Jormungandr, an Aramusha, a Zanhu, and a conqueror. They bore the mark of the Inquisition of Horkos. So they were still here. "Wait, a warmonger? What's your title? Who sent you?" They believed she was a messenger or some form of reinforcements. Seline stood on shaky legs as she turned away from the corpses behind her and faced the living before her. The living who spoke, who did not rot, and yet smelled only of death. "Explain this to me," she hissed, pointing behind her at the atrocity. "What is this?" "Justice," the Zanhu explained, "dispensed upon heretics. We leave the bodies hanging as a warning." "Heretics?" Seline gasped. But they're not cultists." "All who are exposed to the cult are susceptible to their wickedness," the warden explained. "So all will be culled to ensure purity." The words ran through her like ice in her veins, and Seline's grip tightened on her sword. "It's all to ensure peace and justice." Justice. That word filled her consciousness and her mind, and then it exploded. She roared. Hate and wrath filled her every movement. She was upon the Zanhu first, who didn't have time to go for his weapon before her sword had gone through his chest and out the back. The Conqueror was next to move, his flail swinging. Without removing the sword from the Zanhu, Seline kicked the Conqueror backwards and used the still embedded sword to block the swinging chain. Once the flail was caught, she yanked out the sword, pulling both it free as well as the flail from the hand of the Conqueror. The now dead Zanhu fell, making way for the Aramusha and Warden, who attacked together. The Aramusha struck with his first sword. Seline blocked, then adjusted her blade so it would block the second strike. While locked, she slid her sword up, curved the tip, making a loud shriek as she drove the point forward, cutting across the Aramusha's face. She then ducked the Warden's swing, grabbed the blade in his hand, and swung her sword around, bringing the crossguard up to strike into the face of the Warden's helm. His helm proved no defense as it caught and stuck fast. She yanked hard and pulled the Warden's body into the Aramusha, who was still howling in pain. When he collided with the Aramusha, the two stumbled, leaving only the Jormungandr left standing, who let out a scream of rage and charged her. The girl's hammer crashed into the ground at Seline's feet as she spun out of the way and brought her sword up in an arch directly at the warrior's arm. The sword caught, pulling clean through, removing the Jormungandr's arm at the elbow. The woman screamed madly and fell to her knees as Seline brought the blade back around, removing her head with a clean swing of her sword, silencing the howling woman. As she steadied herself, the Aramushan Conqueror were recovering and coming back for the attack. Seline swiftly reached into her hip satchel and pulled out a refined purchase of draconite. She ground it in her clawed fingers and ran it along her bladed edge as she'd been taught. The Aramusha rushed in first, and Seline dove out of his way to slash at his leg. The blow cut shallow, but that was all she needed. The draconite instantly began to infect and corrode the leg muscles and joints, releasing a steady and noxious odor which the Conqueror was forced to flee from, lest he inhale the stench and risk infection as well. All who were aligned with Horkos knew the danger of direct contact to draconite, and they knew better than to risk exposure. The Aramusha fell, gripping his leg and gritting his teeth in pain. But the wound was shallow, and the pain would pass in a few minutes if he held fast. But he wouldn't. She knew he wouldn't, because those who deal in pain often don't handle it well when presented with it themselves. As he gripped and yanked at his leg, she then buried her blade deep into his collarbone and down into his torso, sinking her sword all the way to the hilt into his body. His screams were outlandish until her sword went through his lung. Then they stopped as he rolled his head to the side, dead. The Conqueror attacked, shield tackling Seline, who let herself be knocked back. She tumbled and rolled with the blow, coming up as the Conqueror swung his flail at her. Perhaps it was her rage making her blind to fear, but she didn't retreat from the attack. And that was indeed what saved her. She rushed forward, sword still stuck in the dead Aramusha's body. The flail swung wide and past her head as she slammed her clawed hand into the Conqueror's helm, gripping the steel and making the claws scrape, screaming as metal tore at metal. The two began to struggle and grapple with each other. The Conqueror locked his leg around hers and brought her to the ground with his body on top. Raising his shield to finish her with a blow to the head, Seline threw up her arms to block the blow. Feeble as it would be, she had to try. The Conqueror reared up to strike, and she stared death in the face. There was a loud gonging sound as something hard struck the Conqueror's helm. He grunted in pain and then fell forward as the solid circular disc fell to the ground next to him. Seline looked up from the unconscious knight to see two figures approaching. One walked to the disc, which Seline now realized to be a shield, and she picked it up, inspecting it for damage. It was an Aphira. She wore black armor, which looked a little worn and tired. She inspected her shield, and finding no damage, stepped back to inspect the damage on the other Inquisitors. The other, who approached, carried a large kite shield, her helmeted head covered by a cowl. A black prior. And yet she had no symbol of Horkos on her armor. Was she one of the turncoats who joined Chimera? It wasn't likely. There were no symbols of Chimera on her armor either. She looked at the carnage around her, and then gazed at the warmonger Seline. "Lamia," the prior grunted in a mature and tired voice, "check the nearby inn and tavern for more agents of the Inquisition." "What about this one?" Lamia asked. "I will see to her," the prior answered Lamia. The Aphira turned on her heels and went to the small inn where the Inquisitors had emerged from to check it for stragglers. Meanwhile, the prior turned her face to Seline. "Your name?" she asked. "Azazel,"
she hissed. Your real name, child, the prior corrected. No demon weeps at the sight of the dead. Seline. I am Deborah. Selene's face turned to look this woman in the face, or rather the helm. She knew that name. She'd heard it in whispers among Horkos, and even before she joined them, the wandering angel of judgment, a former nun turned paladin. This was her. Judge Deborah, what are you doing here? Seline demanded. The Inquisition has grown quite bold in recent months. I'm traveling to known locations they've established themselves and contending with them. It took me longer than I would have liked to come here, she answered. She turned her attention to the gallows behind Seline and walked towards them. I can presume you had no hand in this, seeing as you have turned your sword against these fools. This was my home, Seline snarled, and it was I who begged Horkos to come here, to liberate it from the cult. Deborah's shoulders sank some as she heard the confession. This was not your doing, Seline. It may as well have been, Seline snapped. I fled this place 2 years ago. I ran to get help. I begged Horkos to send the aid of the Inquisition. I'd heard the Inquisition retook the town, but I had no idea, no clue they had done all this. I don't understand it. Why do this? They were innocents. Many of them were children. Justice, Deborah said with a shrug of her shoulders, or the Inquisition's perverted definition of it. And there was that word again. It had made Seline want to spit. She snarled and rounded on Deborah. What justice is there in this? This is what you would call just? Deborah didn't rise to the scream, but merely stared at the gallows as though lost in the bodies, picturing who they might have been once. Horkos is struggling, she explained simply. They've defeated Chimera. Heathmoor is theirs for the taking. But that was only the easy part. Now that they are poised to take Heathmoor, they have to prove that they can control it as well. It is not enough to conquer a land, you must hold authority. And to that end, Astria intends to impose what she calls absolute justice, the purging of evil by any means necessary. The cult of the stake attempts to usurp her authority in Ashfeld, turn these lands back to a time of spiritual discipline and authority. That can't be allowed to stand for Horkos. So to ensure no converts rise, not only the cult, but all who are exposed to them who might convert, must be punished. To strike terror in the hearts of all of Heathmoor, to remind them of the fate of those who would defy the authority of Horkos, and their absolute justice. Deborah spoke in such a somber tone that Seline found herself almost losing the hate she felt in her soul, but instead replacing it with a deep confusion. Then they think what they've done here is righteous? Who defines what is right? Deborah asked, finally turning to face Seline. Is it Horkos? Chimera? Me? You? Who gets to decide that? What is justice and who determines it? I don't know what justice is. All I know is that this it cannot be it. This is barbarism, Seline snarled. So you tell me, Judge Deborah, what is justice? Deborah paused a moment and inhaled slowly, taking off her helmet at last, showing a weary, tired face, hair with lines of silver running through it and lines along her cheeks that showed the age of this woman. Justice is bringing right to the wrong, she answered. Justice is seeking evil and destroying it, and seeking righteousness and nurturing it. Justice is saving the desperate and the oppressed, while punishing the wicked and the guilty. Justice is not something any man can define, for it is defined by a higher power than any man. Seline snorted. You speak of God like a priest or bishop. If the righteous of this world would be so easily decided by the hearts of men and women like those in Horkos, then you have no right to argue with them, Deborah remarked. Astria believes that strength defines everything. Those with strength will rule and make the rules, and the strong are found through conflict. And if she is correct, then her strength alone makes her right. You cannot fight all of Horkos and win, child. So tell me, if you can't beat her, doesn't that make Horkos right? Well, of course it doesn't, Seline argued. Then that means there is an authority that supersedes Astria's. So what is it? Seline and Deborah stared at each other a long moment, gazing into each other's faces. They both wrestled with the words they were throwing. My lady, I've checked the surrounding buildings and found only evidence of Inquisition presence. No bodies or agents. Lamia called, finally rejoining her judge. Deborah turned to look to Lamia and offer her thanks before joining to Seline again. This conversation is over for now. I cannot promise you will find what you seek, but if you wish to come with me, I can introduce you to a former agent of the Inquisition who, like you, is in search of true justice and an end to this war. A former pirate named Yen Chen. Perhaps she can help you find your purpose, and you can find your answer to what justice is.
Masayori was gurgling pathetically, clutching the wrist of Seline as she held him by the throat. Her clawed gauntlet was buried in his neck. Blood pooled slowly down her wrist, dripping from her steel arm onto the floor below. Her eyes, cold and gray, bore into his own, and she allowed herself a low growl. He had run headlong into her strike. She had anticipated his attack and struck before he ever reached her. I'm done with Horkos, with Chimera, with all of it. I'm carving out the festering blight. I'm cutting out the infection wherever I find it. Every one of you deluded cowards who butchered in the name of your self-righteous ambitions will face true justice. With a single yank, she pulled her hand from his throat, and the blood poured out. Masayori sank to the ground, clutching his neck in a desperate attempt to stem the flow. But Seline only walked around him, placing a foot on his back, pressing him to the ground. He tried to beg, to shout, to do anything with his voice, but the gurgle was the only sound he could make. I am vengeance for those who cannot take it. She drew her sword, placed the edge on the side of his bloody neck. I am the justice for the forcibly silenced. She pressed down on the edge, beginning to cut it into the already present wound, drawing it out and increasing the flow of blood. Masayori's face was beginning to pale. His eyes were clouding. And I am death to those who find pleasure in bloodshed. With a final stroke, she finished the cut, and Masayori's head came off at the neck, blood pooling from the stump. Seline had indeed found Yen Chen. The two had worked to undermine the Inquisition, and she hadn't seen Deborah for ages. However, a reunion was soon due, and she would not go before her old mentor empty-handed. How many is it now? Deborah asked, patiently drinking from her goblet, her silvery hair tied back covering her tired face. Seline sat across from her in the garden, having not even touched her cup. Masayori was the 5th Horkos agent who had ties to the Inquisition, so I have now killed 5 of them. I know there are others, but I do not know their faces or names yet. Then what will you do while you wait for more information? Deborah asked. Yen Chen has fled with the artifacts. She's been gone for ages, and I do not know where she is. So, if you will have me, I would travel with you for a time, until I find a new purpose. Lamia is the only assistant I need, Deborah snorted. I hardly need another disciple. I will not go to Chimera, if indeed they truly remain, Seline argued, and my past allegiance to Horkos makes me an enemy of the Hatun and many other people in Heathmoor. I have nowhere to go. And do you think I do? Deborah asked. My work requires me to travel constantly. I hunt for those who've sinned against Ashfeld and her people. I strike against the wicked and the immoral. I have no home of my own. I cannot give you one. If you truly wish to follow me, you must relinquish your self-righteous crusade. Seline stared, confused. She bit back an insult, a snap. She didn't know what she meant. She picked up her cup and took a drink, allowing herself to think a moment, and then set it down again. I don't understand, Seline said. Deborah put down her cup. She rubbed a hand along her brow in fatigue. I have looked over your vendetta against the Inquisition for their crimes against your town, and because the Inquisition is indeed a detestable and heretical organization that must be made to face justice. But the issue, my child, is you do not strike for justice as you claim to, but for vengeance. I don't understand. Are they not the same? That response alone shows me you do not yet understand a thing, which is why you cannot travel with me.
Deborah sighed, setting down her cup and standing again. Then help me to understand, Judge Deborah. What is it I do not comprehend? Vengeance is blood for blood and flesh for flesh. And it is an endless cycle of bloodshed that will not end, nor will it give you peace or bring relief to the harmed, Deborah explained. Justice is not just striking at evil, my child. It is bringing righteousness to the unrighteous, bringing light to the darkness, bringing hope to the needy. You do not merely destroy evil, you demonstrate righteousness for those who have been denied it. Revenge, killing your quarry in hidden cells to make them suffer, only satisfies a blood debt. Justice must satisfy the soul. And until you understand this distinction, you will remain Azazel, a demon of vengeance, not an angel of justice. Then teach me, Mother Superior. Seline bowed her head. I do wish to learn. I wish to be an angel of justice. I have no love for my former demon name. Your words sound sincere, but is your heart? Deborah asked. I do not doubt your desire, Seline. But I know in your soul you still harbor a great hatred. You still feel that pain you suffered of betrayal. I know this pain. I felt it when my church was burned and my precious sisters were violated and mutilated. Lamia, my ward, felt it when she was taken from her family as a child and enslaved. We know your agony, Seline. We know the resentment and the hate you carry. But we have chosen to walk the path of angels. We do not let it dictate our courses. Tell me, Seline, what path do you wish to walk? Would you choose to walk the path of justice with myself and Lamia, and forsake your current vendetta against the Inquisition? Or will you stay on this path you have been walking and continue your hunt for those who did you wrong? I will not judge your decision either way. But if you remain on the path of vengeance, then our ways part here. Seline leaned back, hanging her head somewhat. The weight of the Mother Superior's words were heavy, and they weighed down on her shoulders as they slumped. Can you give me a day to pray on this, Mother Superior? Please, do not forsake me yet. You have until dawn tomorrow, she answered. Then Lamia and I move on to Valkenheim, where our work is needed. Deborah stood up at last and turned to leave, as Seline sat in stupefied confusion. What should she do? What could she do? Truthfully, she didn't want to abandon her hunt. There were other Inquisition agents who had a hand in what happened to her town and family, and they couldn't be allowed to live. And yet, she thought back on the 5 lives she'd already taken. The 5 men and women who she'd locked inside a cell just like Masayori, butchered, tortured, and killed. And she felt nothing at their recounting. Though she called it justice, she felt no peace, no joy, and no respite. In fact, she only felt empty. Was Deborah right? Was she merely walking a path of a vengeful demon, guising it in the art of justice, just as Astria had done? She glanced at the helm in her hands and bowed her head low as she prayed for an answer. As the sun began to rise on the morn, Deborah loaded her pack onto one of the horses for their travel. As she walked to tighten the straps around on the other side, Lamia stopped carrying what she had and set it down, glancing up the hill beyond them as the sun rose. Lady Deborah, I see someone approaching, she said softly. They're armed. Should we prepare for... There's no need to fear, Lamia. Deborah smiled without looking. That is no foe who approaches, but an angel of justice seeking her wings.